my name is Jim McKeeth from Rim Object Software, and welcome to What's New in Embarcadero Prism XE3. Here's the agenda for what we're going to cover today in this session. The times along the right are for if you're watching this during the replay, you can just jump to that time in the video and go to the part you're interested in. There's a lot that's new in XE3, and there's a lot we're not going to be able to cover as well. So, for example, we're not going to be able to go into detail about the new support for Visual Studio 2012 and all of the new features it adds. It adds a number of features as well as a lot of performance improvements, and there's a lot of options available there. We do still support Visual Studio 2010, so if you have Visual Studio 2010 installed, you can install Prism into 2010 instead. Some of the features we're not going to get into as well are flow control analysis, mapped types, and support for .NET Framework version 4.5. But you can learn about these features and more at the new Oxygene language website, oxygenlanguage.com. So first, let's talk a little about compatibility and the ecosystem that Embarcadero Prism XE3 is part of. Now, Embarcadero Prism XE3 is powered by the Oxygene for .NET compiler provided by Rim Object Software. And that provides you with access to .NET, Mono, and Windows frameworks and runtime, which gives you access to a variety of platforms. Also shipping as part of Rad Studio XE3 is Delphi XE3. Delphi XE3 provides support for Win32, Win64, and Mac OS X platforms through the VCL and FireMonkey frameworks. Now, the overlap here is the code compatibility between Delphi and Oxygene. They both share a common ancestor of Object Pascal, so most of the code is actually compatible. The incompatibilities come in from the frameworks that are in use. So, for example, the FireMonkey and VCL framework is only available on Delphi XE3, whereas the .NET and Mono frameworks with tools like WPF, etc., are only available for Oxygene for .NET. Now, there are code compatibility settings available as part of your Oxygene for .NET project that can enhance that compatibility between the two languages. Another option is the Oxidizer tool that's built into Oxygene for .NET. The Oxidizer tool makes it easier to move code from Delphi to Oxygene for .NET. Still not going to support the VCL and FireMonkey though. Oxidizer doesn't stop there. It also makes it easy to move code from C# to Oxygene for .NET. You can simply copy and paste it from the online documentation or samples you might find online and paste it as Oxygene for .NET code. Back during the XE2 time period, we introduced Oxygene for Java as Project Cooper. Oxygene for Java adds support for Linux, Android, and a number of other platforms. Oxygene for Java is a different flavor of the Oxygene language. It's the same language, just targets a different platform. It is a separate product available from Rim Objects, but it's important to understand how it all fits into the same ecosystem here together. So possibly, in my opinion, the most interesting platform it does add is, of course, Android. Oxidizer was also enhanced to add support for moving Java code into Oxygene for Java. And this time around, we're introducing another new flavor of Oxygene called Nougat. Nougat adds support for Mac OS X and iOS development. It supports the Cocoa and Cocoa Touch frameworks and the Objective-C runtime. So this allows you to build fully native iOS and Mac OS X applications because it uses the exact same frameworks and runtimes that you would be using if you're using Objective-C. So, like I said before, Oxygene for Java and Nougat are two separate flavors of the Oxygene language that are available from Rim Object Software. It's important to understand that all three of these flavors are 100% code compatible. So the code that they use is exactly the same on all three flavors, but the frameworks are separate. So anytime you're not using a specific framework, that code can be shared between those three different versions of Oxygene. So that is an overview of the Oxygene for .NET ecosystem that you get to take advantage of as a user of Embarcadero Prism XE3. To get started doing Windows 8 development, the first thing you need is a copy of Windows 8. And the reason is that's the only place that you're going to find the WinRT, the Windows runtime. Now, Microsoft did not include the designers for WinRT or the modern UI in the Visual Studio shell, which is what ships with Oxygene for .NET. So in order to get those, workarounds you can do is actually install Visual Studio Express 2012 for Windows 8 first. Now there's a few different versions of Express. You're going to get the one that says for Windows 8. Install that one. It's a free product. Requires registration, although you could probably get it without registering because you're never actually going to use it. All you're going to do is install that. It installs the modern UI designers, and then when you install Oxygene for .NET, it installs the Visual Studio 2012 shell, and then it has access to the modern UI designers. So that works great. You have to keep the Express Edition installed. You can't uninstall it, but you don't have to ever use it. I did a webinar previously on Windows 8 development in general. You can check out that webinar at the address there. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail today, but not all of it. So for more information, check out that webinar. So the Windows 8 platform is split into two different parts. There's the modern UI style apps and the desktop apps. Modern UI was previously called Metro, but they've changed the name to Modern UI now. The modern UI style apps uses the Windows runtime, the WinRT, and this replaces Silverlight.NET Win32 or the browser that you would use on the desktop side. So here on the modern UI style apps, you use Oxygene with the Windows runtime and then XAML to create the view, the interface layer. So it's important to note that Oxygene is available on both sides here. You can use Oxygene for the modern UI style apps or Oxygene for desktop apps on Windows 8. So now let's take a look at Windows 8 development in detail. Windows 8 was just barely released. Microsoft is shipping Windows 8 desktops, Windows 8 updates, as well as their new Surface tablets that have Windows 8 on it, whether it be Windows 8 Pro or WinRT, the tablet version. Microsoft says this is the future of the desktop, and hopefully they're hoping the future of the tablet as well. So this is we're looking at here is the Windows 8 start screen. All new apps are installed here on the start screen. Now these ones that have these nice interactive tablets tiles here are the Windows 8 applications. They have interactive tiles, and these applications are all obtained through the Windows Store. This is where you want your app. Everybody that's going to be running Windows 8 is going to be downloading their apps from here. This is the place they're going to get their apps, whether it be free apps like Netflix or paid apps like here's Angry Birds Space for $4.99. Right now there is 957 apps in here, at least games, so lots of space for more apps to come in, but there's already a pretty good collection of apps showing up. And of course, if users want to dive in and search for an app, they're going to use the search over here, and they're going to search for a cool app. And this is where you want your app to show up, right? So if they come in and they search for your app, this is where they're going to find it at. So how do you get here? One thing I want to point out is let me go back here and go down here to security. So there's two different ways apps can show up in here. You can have the security. Where's it at? Okay, here's security. So this category contains the different types. It has desktop apps, and then these are WinRT apps. So a desktop app, if I click this, it's going to give me a link to go to the publisher website and then download it. Whereas if I click this WinRT app, I can actually install it from here. So the great thing about a WinRT app is, first of all, it automatically gets installed from here. Plus, you'll notice up here, it's telling me I have updates. All my WinRT apps that get updated will automatically get notifications through the Windows Store, and then I can click that and automatically download those updates. And then also, there's a lot of cool features that come with being a Windows RT application, like the ability to use the SkyDrive to sync data across all their devices. But also, if the user moves to another device or reinstalls their operating system, all their WinRT applications will download onto the new computer for them automatically. So even after they format their hard drive, boom, they can restore all their WinRT apps immediately and all their data with it. So it's a great feature to be able to be a full-fledged Windows RT application, so you can take advantage of all these features that come with that. So what's the best way for you to get there, to get your app in the store? It is through Prism. XE3 Prism, Oxygene for .NET, gives you the ability to create full WinRT applications. If you come in here to help show REM objects everywhere welcome screen, and then click on Oxygene, you'll find under language or under category, go to not WPF, WinRT. We have 4 examples here of showing you examples of how to build Windows RT applications. So this is the app bar example. I'll go ahead and run this real quick. So one of the characteristics of a WinRT application is that the canvas area, the main content area, should just show content. That content may be interactive or not, but anything that's not accessed all the time is in what's called an app bar. And you access the app bars on the desktop by right-clicking, and it brings this up. On a Surface tablet, you swipe from the bottom or the top to bring these up. So these are buttons or any kind of control really you want to put here that is things that the user is not going to use regularly. They're going to use them semi-regularly. So not something they're going to use every time they're in the app. So these can be sticky. So in this case, I have a checkbox there that makes this sticky so that doesn't go away. Or they can go away as soon as they click out of it, like that. So that's an app bar, one of the main characteristics of a Windows 8 WinRT application. So let's take a look at how to implement this. The first thing here is on the main page XAML is we're going to declare an app bar here. And you can do that over here from the Property Explorer. So on the page, we have an app bar. And so you can click this button here and hit New, and it's going to add this if you don't have one already. But in this case, in this example, we do have an app bar. And so in this app bar, we have a top app bar and a bottom app bar. And in here, we're just adding in a grid that's going to define how we're laying things out. So our grid has 2 columns. So you see right here, it's showing the 2 columns. 50% goes into each column. And then in the first column, we have a stack panel. So that's, you can see here, it's assigned to column 0. And in that stack panel, we just have a checkbox and a button. So I'm using a style here, and these styles come with here under standard styles. So those are referenced automatically, included in your app. And so you just want to say, I'm using this star app bar button style. And then that gives your button the right style. And that way they're going to look like the rest of the buttons in the app. And there is a special font that provides these glyphs that we're using here. There's a number of styles already predefined, or you can look into that standard styles XAML to figure out how they're defined to find your own styles. And then we have so we have 2 stack panels here, there with the buttons in it, and then on the bottom, they're the same scenario. There's a grid saying we have 2 different columns there. We could add a 3rd column if we wanted to, and then the buttons in the stack panel. So we've added these buttons here, and then these buttons, each button has a click event handler. In this case, all the buttons use the same event handler. And navigate to event handler, and then here's the code behind that we're writing to handle that. And so all these are funneled in the same place for a simple example, just so you can see how it all works. Go ahead, and you're going to want to come in here and take a look at these different WinRT examples so you can get an idea of how to develop a WinRT application so your app can be in the Windows Store and show up on all these, I'm sure, soon to be millions of Windows 8 devices that are in the wild already today. When you're doing Windows 8 development, one of the things you can take advantage of is how your app integrates with Windows 8. And it's really important that you can present a consistent experience to your users in the way that your app integrates with Windows 8. So for example, here I am on the start screen, and if I just start typing Oxygene, it'll take me to the Oxygene command line compiler app. I can also jump to files or settings that are related to that as well. Plus, I could dive into news, for example, and there's nothing related to Oxygene and news, but I could search for maybe Hurricane Sandy in the news and get results here from that. So all of this is done through this sidebar here, okay? So this, it's called the charm, the search charm that pops out is available in all applications for doing search, all your Windows WinRT applications that need to do search. So if, for example, I'm in, we'll say, the store, and I want to search, I can just hit Windows key Q, which brings up the search charm, and I can search for games related to birds. And there's Angry Birds Space, and I can jump right to Angry Birds Space. Once I've installed this, then I would type, if I typed Angry Birds Space from the start screen, it would then launch Angry Birds Space for me. So all search-related activities that are done in a Windows RT application, modern UI application, is done through the search charm. So it's always going to be done through the same place for the user. And so this creates a consistent experience for the user. So let's look at how we would do this from an application. So this is the search sample that ships with Oxygene or Prism XE3. And we're going to run this. So it has a little explanation here telling you that you can use Windows key Q to bring up the search charm, or if you do Windows key C, brings up all the charms, and then search goes into search charm. So two different ways you can get to the search charm. Once in the search term, we can now search, and what this one does is, since this app has focus, then it gets the search query. Okay, so I type rim objects and it gets sent here to the search query, and then the app is then able to send back suggestions and say, hey, this is what I have available here. And so the query submitted, they selected rim objects SDK for Java. Okay, and so then now if we go to Bing, and here it does a search for rim objects SDK for Java on the internet. But if I do a search again here, we can then jump back into our search sample and jump back into our application. So now our application was activated with a query of rim objects. So by implementing this declaration, by declaring that our app supports search, it gives this unified search experience so that the users can search our app the same way they would search the store or the news. And also, our app can then show up in the side here and be activated from outside of our app. So a user can activate our app from elsewhere, and as we use this more often, it would move up the list of this. So if a user was using your app to as a search result more often, it would move up this list to be higher in the list. So this is really all about integrating your app into the Windows 8 operating system. So let's take a look at how this works with the search and what you need to do. So this, again, like I said, is the search sample that ships with Oxygene for .NET or Prism XE3. And so there's two different places we have to implement this here. Three different places, actually. So if we go into the package app manifest, this is where we declare that we support search. So the available declarations are here, and this just tells the operating system what your app supports. Okay. Now this is different than the capabilities, which is saying things that your application wants to be able to do, and then the user has to grant permission for your app to be able to do that. Instead, these are things that you're telling that your app's telling the operating system that it will support, that if the operating system asks it to, it can then do. So we have search added here as a supported declaration. So once we've done that, there's two different places we're going to handle events. The first one is in the app XAML.pass file, which is the main application code. We have a onSearch activated. So onSearch activated is where we're going to receive a call if our app is activated from search. So in the example I gave when I was in Bing and then went and found it on the list on the side and clicked it, it then got that search query. So this is when your app was not currently the active app and it gets activated via the search query. And so in this case here, all I'm doing is making sure that we're on the main page, which is the only page in this app. And then I'm passing in the query text. Now the query text comes from the search activated event args that are given to this event when it's activated. So that's how we know what the query that the user asked for. Okay, so that is how we handle being activated via search. And then in the main page.xaml.pass file, in our constructor here, I'm getting the search pane for the current view here. And then I'm assigning event handlers, the query submitted, query changed, suggestions requested, and results suggestion chosen to assigning these event handlers so that I can handle these. And so that means that when I'm the active one, if there is one of these events happens, I can then handle that. So query submitted means that they've selected a query from the side and hit enter or select it from the drop down. Query changed means as they're typing in a query, I can be notified of that query. And so this gives me the ability to have my app, for example, filter down the results in real time as they're typing the query in the search. Very cool. Suggestions requested means that as they're typing over there, occasionally it will say, hey, can you give me suggestions to display in the side here based on what they've typed? And so then you can then return those suggestions, to the search bar, so that it can provide a list of suggestions. It only provides 5 suggestions is the max you can provide, but it gives a chance for them to narrow it down. So there's a lot of consideration you should put into what suggestions you should return back there. And then if they select one of those suggestions, the result suggestion chosen event fires. And so in here, you can see I have the handlers implemented. And so all we're doing is just displaying a status of what the query was. So again, we have an args that contains a query text, and we're just saying what query submitted was, what the query text is on the query text changed. And then here's where we return back a suggestions. So when it's requested suggestions, this is how we return it back. And we have a suggestion list, which is stored up at the top here of our application. Suggestion list, just a hard-coded array, but you could, any place you're going to be pulling your suggestions from, whether it be a list of news articles or whatever, that's where you would get that. And so in this case, all I'm doing is going through and finding out, doing a string comparison. And if they compare, if they match up, then we just return one of those. Do whatever logic you wanted to do here to decide what is a possible suggestion. This is a very simple logic here, but again, this could be as complex as you want it to be. And then since we can only return 5, as soon as we get 5, we just stop our loop, so we don't have to go through all of them. That's really all there is to it. And once you've done this, then our app implements search support. So it's really important that your app, in order to fit into the ecosystem, does support search this way. You do not want to have search in the bar. So see here now, we've moved up the list of providers. So I can do a search for Oxygene, and it lists all of the root keywords that have Oxygene in them. So, and then let's see, I can do Java, and it matches it. So in this case, it's doing a matching instead of a starts with, but you can again use any logic you want to here. Query submitted. I'll go back to news and do a search for Java. And so we see here's the news is supporting. This is the query results coming from the news app for Java. But then here's my search sample. I can click on that and come back, and it says search activation Java. So very cool way that we've integrated our app into the operating system, into the Windows 8 operating system, to create that consistent experience for the users. Something that's very important to WinRT development, the modern UI development, is that you don't want to be blocking your main UI thread, because blocking the main UI thread results in an app that's not responsive. So if you've done development in Silverlight previously, you're familiar with this, that everything had to be synchronous. You can't have anything that's going to block the UI thread, or it's going to take up time on the UI thread, because doing that causes the UI to stop responding. Now, in Silverlight development, you were familiar with that you had to do all these hoops to jump through in order to make these asynchronous calls in your application. In WinRT, you don't need to do that anymore, thanks to the introduction of the await keyword in the Oxygene language. So let me give you an example here. So I have an HTTP client, and I want to get the response from that. So normally, you would say http.get. Now you notice get is gone. Get has been replaced with a get async. Now anytime you're doing WinRT development, most of the things you're going to would have previously done are now going to be the asynchronous version of that. And that means that it's asynchronous. And they're doing that in order to force you to not block the main UI thread. If you do something that is not asynchronous, you will get an runtime error. An exception will be raised and say, hey, you can't do this. You're blocking the main UI thread. So I'm going to go ahead and use get async here and grab the feed from blogs.rumobjects.com. Now, when I mouse over a response here, it tells me its type. And you notice it's not an HTTP response message. Instead, it's a system.threading.tasks.task of HTTP response message. And so if I try and use this now, I don't have a content on here because it's not a response message. It is a task. So what that means is if I run this, I'm not going to get the content back from this HTTP message because the content hasn't come back at this point. Because this is asynchronous, it's going to launch this in the background, and I'm going to have just the task here to deal with. So if you were doing Silverlight development, for example, you would have to create a series of callbacks and pass in, say, hey, if it succeeds, go here. If it fails, go here. And then your code at this point just finishes. So it was doable, but it was a lot of extra code. It was a lot harder to maintain the code. Luckily, like I said, in Oxygene, we have the new await keyword. So let me show you how this is going to work. So all I do is add the await keyword here. And now if I mouse over here, you see now my response is the HTTP response message, which is what I would have expected to get if I wasn't calling an asynchronous method. So what happens in the background here, the compiler takes this and runs that task and then captures all the code below here, and that code gets called when the task finishes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of the code here for this. And so now I'm going to be able to access the content on response. And then instead of read string, I'm using read string asynchronous because, again, reading that string could be long. It may not have all come down at once. And so that could take a while as well. So I'm using an await there as well. And so the result is XML is going to be a string that I'm going to be able to put in the text of the XML box, the text box on the UI. So what this is happening here is this code, all this code, the grabbing that, and then all this code here is being captured and held in a elsewhere. And then this code is this event click handler is going to finish, and it's going to get 100 at the end. And then later, when the get async task finishes, then it will execute this code, which again does the same thing. It's going to capture this until this finishes, and then execute that. There's a lot of complex stuff that happens in the compiler behind the scenes that you don't have to worry about. It makes writing asynchronous code very simple, as you can see here. So the result is this is going to be completely asynchronous. The UI thread's not going to block. It's going to remain responsive. And then this is going to execute just like we would expect if it was non-asynchronous code. So await lets you write asynchronous code in a synchronous manner. Very, very amazing stuff. Now, if you do want to get into the guts of it and get behind the scenes, you can still write asynchronous code like you would before. You can deal with the task yourself and stuff like that. There's no reason to. Let the compiler do what it's good at and do this for you. But in scenarios where you need to do that or feel like you need to do that, at least you can do that. So I'm going to go ahead and run this and you can see what happens here. So here's my user interface. I'm going to right click, bring up my app bar and click the refresh button. And so you notice my UI thread's remaining responsive while it does in the background. So the UI remained responsive because it's all happening asynchronously, but we wrote the code synchronously all in the event handler. Now, of course, if it was really complex, you want to put that elsewhere outside the event handler, but the point is that you can write asynchronous code in a synchronous manner. Very cool stuff, very amazing, and really is going to improve your productivity and also make your code easier to maintain, because this is way easier to maintain than synchronous code like you would have had in Silverlight. If you've ever written in Silverlight, you know that that code is more complex because of the way you have to deal with the synchronous nature of Silverlight development. So await keyword, make sure you start taking advantage of that. This isn't limited only to WinRT development. The await keyword was introduced in Oxygene, and it's available in other elsewhere with Oxygene language. You're using it in other versions of .NET. So you don't have to just use it for WinRT development, but if you're doing WinRT development, you're going to need to take advantage of it because everything is asynchronous. The fixit functionality was introduced in an earlier version of Oxygene, and that was where the compiler could detect certain classes of syntax errors, warnings, or other errors in your code that it knew how to fix, and it would give you a single-click option to fix those errors. We've taken fixit to the next level, though, in the latest version of Oxygene. Let me show you. So I have some code here. I'm going to go ahead and hit build, and it's giving me warnings on all these lines here, saying case for identifier does not match original case. So this is telling me the case is wrong. Now, just like Pascal, Oxygene's not case-sensitive language, but we're all professional developers. We want to be consistent in our code. We want our code to reflect our professionalism, and so we want it to use consistent casing. So we could use the existing fixit functionality and just click one of these and say adjust the case for to match string and fix that one line, and then fix the next line, and then fix the next line. Or if you're paying attention here, you notice there's a new option here. Enable autofix for W0. W0 is warning 0. That's the compiler code for this particular warning. So if I enable this, then it's going to automatically fix that next time I hit build. So watch here, all these identifiers are going to magically become uppercase. Now it still gave me the warnings down below telling me it fixed them, so I know what's going on. Nothing's happening behind my back, but now it's fixing those for me automatically. And if I come in here and add a new one, var 01 object, and hit build, it fixed it for me automatically. So now going forward in the future, all my cases will be correct on my identifiers, so my code will reflect my professionalism. Now we didn't stop there. I'm coming down here and I'm going to add a new line, console dot. Now you notice I'm missing the E on console, but that's okay because the compiler figures out, has a spell checker in there, it figures I'm probably meant console. So it's going to come up here and give me the option to have code completion here. So I'm going to add read key, but watch what happens when I hit build. So that was the old existing fixit functionality, is that it gave me code completion here, and if I hit click this, it gives me the option to replace console with the E on the end. Okay, so that's nothing new there. But what's new, and I'll show you here, is under options, if I come here to projects and solutions, Oxygene, fixit, this checkbox here, treat fixable errors as warnings. If I check that and then come in here and hit OK, I'm going to hit build, so I haven't changed my code, I'm still missing the E, and I'm going to hit run, and it's gone ahead and ran my code. And you notice here it says unknown identifier on console still, so it's still reporting it as a warning. So now I can run my code, I can be in the groove, writing code. It doesn't matter if I make a simple spelling mistake. When I hit run, if it knows how to fix it, which there's a lot of errors it knows how to fix now, it will let you run that. And then later, while this is running and I haven't gone out of the groove, I can come back and click that and say replace console with an E. And now my code is syntactically correct and will still run. So this is a great way for you to stay in the groove once you get in the groove writing code and not have to jump back out and fix simple little errors all the time. So another great performance improvement to Oxygene through the fixit functionality. The Gendarme code analysis provides an additional level of analysis on your application, going beyond the compiler errors or warning that you previously may have received. This will detect code smells, maintainability issues, things that maybe make your code less portable to other platforms, as well as performance issues. We'll go ahead and take a look at Gendarme code analysis in action. So I have this simple little project here, and we'll see that it builds fine. And if we look in the error list, there's no errors and no warnings. So let's take a look at how we turn on code analysis. Go to Project Properties. On the Build tab, scroll to the bottom here, and we turn on code analysis. There's a few options here. We can choose from a default rule set, or if we provide other rule sets, we can use those instead. We can also select a minimum severity and a minimum confidence. Now the severity is how severe of concerns do we want to have reported on. Audit is going to give us all concerns, whereas critical is going to only give us the most critical concerns. The confidence, on the other hand, is how confident do we want the code analysis to be before it reports the concern. So a low might result in more false positive concerns being reported, whereas requiring total confidence may result in some concerns not being reported because it wasn't high enough confidence before reporting it. Config file allows us to specify an alternative config file, and ignore file is where it's going to store the concerns we tell it to ignore. So I'll show you what that looks like here in a little bit. So we'll go ahead and close this, and I hit build now, and you'll see we now have 10 warnings. Each of these warnings represents a concern in our source code. So the first one here is this disposable local is not guaranteed to be disposed of before the method returns. If we click on this, it's going to bring up our fixit window with more details telling us to use the using statement or surround the local's usage with try finally block. And it tells us what the local is f of type file stream, and it's not disposed of, at least locally. So we have options here. We can tell it to ignore this individual code analysis concern or ignore all references of this code analysis concern for the entire project. So I'm going to bring up my Solution Explorer here. And if you watch over here in the Properties folder, when I click this, you'll see a code analysis.ignore file gets added. If I go back into the project properties, we'll see that we've now added that code analysis ignore file in here. And if we go into the code analysis ignore file, we can see that it says this rule, we're ignoring it in this method here. And so that is how it keeps track of where to ignore it. So if you decide later you don't want to ignore it, you can just come in here and remove those two lines, and it will no longer be ignored anymore. So let's go ahead and fix this here. And we can do that as suggested by saying using do begin and that will fix that one for us. So now if I hit build, we'll see that that warning is gone. But we do have another concern here telling we're calling with a file mode parameter but not a file access parameter, and saying that we should use file access if we're using file mode. So now if we come in here and look at the different signatures of this, there's one that takes a file access. So let's go ahead and add that. File access dot read write. And of course now we hit build. Our warnings goes down to 8, and that concern is removed. So now you see the next one here is a high. So let's go ahead and take a look at that one. So this is an interesting one to get here. It's telling us that the type contains visible constants, and their value will be embedded into assemblies that use them instead of a reference. So what that's saying is, right here, magic number, since it's public and a public constant, if it's referenced in another assembly, which it can be because it's public, then that assembly will store the actual value of 42 instead of a reference to this. So now that becomes an issue if we later change 42 without rebuilding the assemblies that reference that. So the solution to this is to change it into a public class var that's read-only. And now watch what happens here. I get a different warning, a different concern back. And this concern saying static read-only fields were found where a literal constant field could be used. And so in this case, there's two different concerns, two different rules that will appear depending on the situation. So it's higher performance to use a constant, but then you have the downside of if you change this value, it doesn't get updated. So you need to decide how it's going to be used in your application, and then make the right choice. So in this case, I'm going to choose to go ahead and ignore this concern because I want to have it as a read-only so that I can update this value and know it will be updated in external assemblies. This one here is really one that you want to pay attention to. It's saying this method creates an exception that is never thrown nor returned to the caller. And if you notice, there's a 2 here, and that's because there's two different concerns. And the second concern is saying that we're ignoring the result value, so we're ignoring what's getting created here by the new. When we satisfy the first concern, they'll both get satisfied. So what's happening is if we go to raise this exception, we're not actually raising an exception here. We're just constructing the exception class. So I'm going to go ahead and say raise, and that's going to go ahead and raise that exception, which will then prevent the work in this method from being executed. So this is really important because if we don't test for a null argument on here in our testing, then when it goes out into production, then if there is ever a null passed, it's not going to behave the way we expected it to. It's still going to run this work instead of raising the null argument exception. So that's a really good one to take care of. Let's go ahead and jump over here to bar. So the first one this is telling us is that the type contains visible instance fields, and it should be encapsulated with a property or method. And if we look, sure enough, we're just exposing value as a variable. So we're going to change this to a property, and Oxygene automatically handles all the encapsulation for that for us automatically. And if we look, there's other concerns here that are being reported. The second one is saying that the type only implements one of equals and get hash code, and it should really implement both. So if we look, sure enough, we're implementing equals, but not get hash code. And the reason is because typically if you're overriding equals, you're changing the way things should be compared, and get hash code is also involved in that. So it's really a good practice. If you're going to override one, you should override both. So let's go ahead and do code completion here. And we'll just return the value. So now another concern here is saying a visible method does not check its parameters for null values. And so if this equals was called and object was null, instead of returning false, it would instead raise a null reference exception. And that's not what we want to have happen. So we're going to go ahead and add a if assigned obj then else exit false. All right, so now if it's not assigned, we'll just go ahead and return false, because obviously if it's null, it's not equal to this object. And then the last concern here that's being reported up here, it's saying that since we override equals object, we ought to also implement I-equatable for type of this object, and then that allows us to implement another one as well, the equals for that object. So we can go ahead and do that by adding in here I-equatable bar, and just use the handy dandy implement interface members. There it is, and we'll jump down to the implementation and add a false, and otherwise we'll exit. And so the great thing about this one is we can actually use other dot value, because we have a reference to the object as its type equals value, instead of just comparing its hash code, which is what we did in the one that just gets an object back. So this gives us a little ability to do a better comparison. So go ahead and hit build. And we'll see there's only one concern left, and this is one that I'm not concerned about. It has to do with the way the assembly is set up, and so I'm just going to go ahead and say ignore this individual code analysis concern. There we go. We've cleaned up all of those concerns we had in our application. A number of those concerns were showing bugs that we needed to take care of, and so this is a great opportunity for us to make our application more robust. So I recommend you turn on code analysis on your existing applications right away, start cleaning up those concerns, and then when you make a new application, turn on the code analysis first, and that way you won't have concerns propagating throughout your application during the development process. Here's an example of some of the little things that just make Oxygene such a nice language to work with. We introduced more readable numerical constants. So here we're showing how we can use spaces in a numerical constant in order to group it and create logical groupings like we would see if we saw these numbers written out somewhere outside of a programming language. So in this case, the max 32, we're splitting it into two different words here. So you can see, oh, there's 4 F's and 4 F's, 8 F's. But if it was all together, then you find yourself going 1, 2, 3, and trying to count it out. So this makes it easier to see how many F's are there, so you know what you're looking at. Here we have the speed of light separated by thousands, like you would expect to see if you're looking at a number that long. And in this, we're looking at the hexadecimal value for orange, and we're splitting it out red, green, blue with spaces in there so that you can see what is there, that it is the way it is separated. So this is a great way of allowing you to make your code more readable, and then in writing your code to express your code in a way that's more like you would expect to see these values if they were not in a programming language. And that's the more readable numerical constants, just allowing you to put spaces in there to make it a little bit easier to see and work with your numbers. So a tuple is a new data structure. It's kind of like a cross between an array and a record. It's like an array in that it's a sequence of values, but it's like a record in that all of those values do not need to be of the same type. Most common use case is to have a method that is returning multiple different types, multiple values. So in this case, I have a record that is returning a string, an integer, and a boolean. So 3 different values of 3 different types. A tuple can be of any number of types, of any different combination of values. You could have a tuple of, in this case, primitive types, or you could have a tuple that contained objects of different types as well. So very flexible in the way it works. And you'll notice it's baked right into the language. The Oxygene language supports tuples as part of the language. It's not some sort of external data structure that you have to construct these objects to use. So this is a common use case here, is as a return type from a method. Without a tuple, you would have had to construct an object that contained these types, or a record that contains these types, or some sort of other complex data structure, or have out parameters on your method, both of which are not ideal solutions. Tuples are ideal for this situation when you want to return multiple types. One place where tuples are really common at is in functional programming. And functional programming is all about working with sets of data. One thing about tuples is they are immutable, which makes them well suited to functional programming, and that means that you can't change a individual value in a tuple. So a tuple that contains a string, integer, and a boolean, you cannot change just the integer. You'd have to recreate an entirely new tuple that contained the new value for that integer in it. So let's take a look at using a tuple here. This is the syntax here. Declared my tuple. That is my return type. And then down here, I'm doing some operation on this string. So ideally, when you have a method that's going to do some sort of expensive operation, whether it be time intensive or resource intensive, and you don't want to do that method more than one time in order to get the different values out, that's when you'd want to use a tuple. Recently, I was doing some cryptography, and I was creating a initialization value as well as a key in the same method, because that was the way the call to the API works. But I wanted to return both of those values out. How do you do that? You have to use a tuple. Otherwise, you have to use out parameters. Like I said, not ideal. So a tuple is great for that. Here, doing the operations, and then down at the bottom, I'm returning all 3 values as a tuple. So this is the syntax to assign a tuple. So in this case, it's being assigned to return the result of this method by passing it to the exit. I could have instead assigned it to a local variable and then passed that in exit as well. So here is a couple different ways you can use it. So I'm going to look at this first example here first. I am using the var keyword in order to infer the type. And so I don't have to declare what kind of type this tuple is. It automatically infers that from the return type of this method. That's a great feature of Oxygene there. So then I'm using the numbered accessors here to access the individual values here. So I'm accessing the string, the integer, and the boolean. Now, the Oxygene compiler knows what type each of these are. And so if this was an integer, for example, I would get a type mismatch because you can't put a string into an integer. So the compiler knows the individual types that make up the tuple. So then I'm using the values here, and then here, this is to show you that it is immutable. If I was to uncomment this line, it would say variable expected, because you cannot put a value into part of a tuple. The tuple is immutable. You cannot change part of the tuple. So here's another test showing you the different syntax. So here I am taking it and I'm actually assigning this, because remember this is a syntax for a tuple here, and so I'm assigning the result of this into the individual variables, local variables here. And these local variables together make a tuple that matches the signature of this method. So 2 different ways of receiving the results back of a tuple there. Very useful in functional programming or when your function is going to return multiple values from it. I hope you've enjoyed this overview of what's new in Prism XE3. If you'd like more information on Prism and the Oxygene language that powers it, visit oxygenlanguage.com. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Jim, at rimobjects.com. Thank you very much.
Okay, a few questions here, and then if you want to ask more of Jim, he's here. The first one, let's look at for real WinRT apps. Being a programmer, and we can both answer this one if you want. Should we wait for Delphi has WinRT, or should you come to Prism? And I mean, I'll answer one part of that, and then you can add to it if you want. If you need to build WinRT applications today, use Prism, because that's the way, as part of Rad Studio or separately from REM objects, that you can build full WinRT apps using Prism and .NET. Delphi, we're focusing on getting to mobile first, and then we'll get to WinRT. But today, if you need to build a WinRT app today, get it in the store today, use Prism. It's part of Rad Studio. Go ahead, Jim.
I would agree with that. Yeah, you can do WinRT today. We've supported it for a while now, actually, even in the betas, and fully functional. You can do everything you can. It's great because using Oxidizer, if you see some code samples, you can convert them from C# right into Oxygene and be ready to go. So it's really easy to get going with building a WinRT application today, and then in the future, if you want to, you can, when Delphi comes out with it, you can certainly use that. And also, you could use some sort of framework if you wanted to, and remote information back and forth between a Delphi application that they're running on the desktop as a service or something like that, and a WinRT application, and share information. So there's lots of options for ways you can, go part way there, or integrate things together.
Jim, is it possible if I've got a Prism WinRT app, can I use Hydra to talk to like VCL or FireMonkey apps or Delphi apps, or is there something because of the whole WinRT part that would keep you from getting via Hydra to something else?
So the WinRT part does prevent that, but I think they're looking at some ways to get around that. I've heard some people that have said they found some interesting ways of doing things, but right now that's not an option with Hydra. In the future, maybe that would be, which would be really cool if you could do that and be able to integrate or embed some VCL or FireMonkey components into your WinRT application.
And for those, I throw these things out like everybody knows, but in case you don't know, Hydra is a product from REM objects that allows you to connect .NET to VCL, .NET to FireMonkey apps, call back and forth, and so on.
Yeah, my opinion, I think all Delphi developers should have Hydra. One thing that's really cool about it is you can, if you're, let's say, you have an existing VCL application, you can actually add FireMonkey controls to an existing VCL form.
Yep.
Very cool. It means you can just mix and match everything however you want to and go. But anyway.
What do you do? What about DLLs? If I have a WinRT app, can I call into DLLs? Like, can I put some Delphi code that I have in a DLL? I'll apologize for not spending much time on WinRT. Just too many things.
You can call if it's a WinRT DLL. Essentially, it's a
okay.
So it'd be a Prism assembly. If your code is not using the VCL, for example, if it's non-visual code, that probably could be easily converted with Oxidizer to Oxygene code and put in a DLL, and then you could totally use it from your WinRT application without crossing any barriers.
Yeah. Here's a question from Scott. It says, does Embarcadero Prism use MS Visual Studio or Embarcadero IDE? And why don't you answer that? Because there's two aspects to using Prism, whether it's WinRT or building a Windows.NET application, right? And what you can.
Right. So Prism is integrated in Visual Studio. It ships with the Visual Studio shell, so you don't have to go buy Visual Studio. It comes with the Visual Studio shell. If you want to do Windows 8 WinRT development, you have to install the Express Edition, which I mentioned there. There's a blog post at blogs.remobjects.com as well about that. But it doesn't install in the Delphi IDE, the Rad Studio IDE. And the reason is because Microsoft's always adding new designers and integrating designers and stuff like that. And if you remember back with Delphi for .NET, it was a big task. It took a lot of resources away from Delphi to put the .NET designers in the Delphi IDE. And so the decision was made to use the designers in the Visual Studio shell so that we didn't have to work on that, split things up. And so this way, when a new designer is added to Visual Studio, you automatically get access to it from Oxygene. So that just seemed like the simplest approach.
I love this one from Ralph. He says, how do you spell Jim? Oh, that's pretty funny. Okay. Let's see. Are the DevExpress.NET components compatible with Prism?
Yes.
At the .NET level, right?
Yeah.
I don't know about the WinRT level, but...
I haven't tried the WinRT ones, but there shouldn't be any reason whatsoever. The only limitation would be is if they have some components that do code generation that doesn't use the DOM. So the official way Microsoft says, if you're going to do code generation, use the DOM. So if they're doing something that's not using the DOM to do code generation, which I can't think of anything in their suite that does that, then it won't work with Prism. Otherwise, should work flawlessly with Prism. If you have any questions about that, feel free to email me, and I'll see what I can find out for you.
Here's one by Alpha. I know part of the answer. It says, but I'm not sure about the other part. Can Prism be used for making Windows? He says Windows Mobile. I'll say Windows Phone 7 apps, and then he also says or Windows 8, Windows Phone 8 apps. I know Windows Phone 8 just came out, but why don't you talk about both Prism and Windows Phone 7 and Windows Phone 7.x maybe and Windows Phone 8?
So I can't remember if it was last year in CodeRage or some other time, but I've done a webinar on using Prism for Windows Phone 7 and Windows Phone 7.1, and also you can also use it for older versions of Windows Phone development. As far as Windows Phone 8, the SDK just came out. It should work, but we haven't created any templates and stuff like that yet. So if you want to try and build it yourself, you might be able to get it to work. Otherwise, hopefully you'll probably, I hate to commit any dates, but should be in the very near future, have a beta that will support Windows Phone 8 development. Based on what we looked at and the way the Windows Phone 8 is architected, it should totally work with that in the very near future.
And they can stay tuned to the RAM objects site and the wiki, right?
Yep.
Or blog.
Yeah, on the blog or the oxygenlanguage.com or blogs.remobjects.com, and then I'm sure probably some announcements through Embarcadero as well.
Or send Jim an email, and I'm not sure how to spell Jim, but it's jim@remobjects.com, so you can do that. Here's a question by Ralph, or maybe it's a statement that ends with a couple questions. And I'll turn this one to you. Maybe we just have a couple more minutes. There is a school of thought out there that once again, Microsoft is abandoning a technology midstream and causing everyone to reboot their development metaphors. Do you think this is happening to Silverlight? Does Oxygene language have Silverlight support?
So the Oxygene language does support Silverlight. Windows Phone 7 development is Silverlight based, so you can do Windows Phone 7 development or regular Silverlight development with Oxygene. Totally fine. As far as Microsoft abandoning it, it does. I believe they've officially said there are no new versions of Silverlight coming out. No new major versions of Silverlight coming out. It's still in use on their site. For example, the WinRT version of Internet Explorer, I believe, does not use Silverlight as well, so that doesn't have a Silverlight plugin for it. So, yeah, Silverlight may be going by the wayside. What they've done, though, is the WPF is the Windows Presentation Foundation Framework, was the big new design paradigm they came out with for, I can't remember when they introduced that, but then they made Silverlight was a subset of that. And what happened is WPF kind of branched out and became more flexible, and so they actually have a WPF for the web now, so you can actually deploy a WPF application over the web, which kind of supersedes what Silverlight did. That's what Silverlight's purpose was. And then also, the WinRT development uses WPF as well. It's a slightly different flavor of WinRT, and then Windows Phone 8 is also going to essentially use that same technology. So what's happened is Silverlight branched off from WPF and then kind of got absorbed back in again, if you would. So the same techniques you would have used as far as XAML, which is the design language for WPF, or Silverlight, is the same. So it's not like the skills are going to be lost, but yeah, they've not maintaining that separate framework anymore.
And then this last one is, are there any examples around the show how to make a DataStep client in Prism? I know I'll put this and then you can go to our DataStep connectors has a proxy writer for C# client, and then you could take that C# code and either you include it as an assembly or you can use the convert or paste convert to Prism and use that stuff with Prism. But I don't know about any tutorials or examples that way. Maybe you know some more, Jim.
That's what I would suggest is one of those two things, either linking as an assembly or converting it. But both those would be options.
Yep.